allowed to romp and tumble as the other children did, the matter would have been rectified promptly. But she was cushioned and padded, her head shielded from the merest drizzle, the curtains drawn against the least draught, as if draught was ever really an issue in Kingston. When Tensie had been born and the family told of her condition, Nathaniel had immediately suspected that Mr. Spiteful was behind it. He had something up his sleeve, Nathaniel could tell. Nathaniel knew the child would not make it, and when he heard that she had to be kept in an incubator, he told Hortense that it was best for the family to accept the fate and start making funeral preparations. "What you want to do that for?" Hortense asked. "The baby isn't dead yet." "Yes, she weighs only 3 pounds now, but she's gaining weight." "Why put yourself through all the fretting and hoping when she's going to die anyway?" Nathaniel argued. "But what is wrong with this man, though, Lord?" Hortense shrieked. "Where there's life, there's hope. We can't give up on the child." "The doctors themselves said that she might not live till her first birthday," Nathaniel said, for he had made sure to inquire of the doctors themselves, and they had filled him in on the dim prognosis. "What's the point in hoping when even doctors have given up?" "What do doctors know anyway?" Hortense said. "And we are her family. We can't give up." Nathaniel would not allow himself to be so naive. He knew Tensie would not make it, and he was not going to bother to put himself through the hassle of hoping and expecting, only to be bashed against the wall of despair by his sworn enemy, Mr. You-Know-Who. It may have been coincidence, and it may have been luck, and it may have been yet another devious snare that Nathaniel got a job at the Children's Hospital. A combination of circumstances had led him to decide to leave the masonry trade. He was getting older, though there were practicing masons who were older than Nathaniel by far. But not only that, Nathaniel had been to the Children's Hospital to visit Tensie on one of her admissions, and he had seen the porters in their blue uniforms wheeling people about in wheelchairs and going here and there delivering important documents, and the job had appealed to Nathaniel. What especially inspired him was the way the porters carted off the stretchers with the covered bodies of children. Then he was told that they were off to the morgue. He took a very deep and morbid interest and kept asking questions of the porters, so that when next he returned, it was more to try to find a job there than to look for Tensie. As if some static energy had been piped up in him and had finally found an orifice for release, Nathaniel became obsessed with all matters surrounding the death of children. When the officer asked Nathaniel if he understood that the job would at times require him to move in and out of the morgue, and that it was a great possibility that he would witness children dying almost every single day at the busy hospital, Nathaniel said that yes, he understood perfectly. Nathaniel did not want the children to die, and he did not entertain any sadistic notion that through their death, Juju's passing would be vindicated. In fact, he wished that he could work it so that no child would have to die, because it seemed unnatural that a child should not grow into ripe old age, outliving their parents. Parents who outlived their children never really lived after that. Never really. But if Mr. Spiteful had been so determined as to land the children in the hospital in the first place, where they swung so precariously between life and death, touch and go like a pendulum, why let them suffer further? Perhaps it was the same way that owners of wounded horses felt. But his initiation did not go as smoothly as Nathaniel had planned. The very first day that he started the job, he saw a child die. Nathaniel had been sitting on one of the chairs in the emergency room for he had just finished his lunch break and he was making ready to start his rounds. There was a commotion outside. A taxi had pulled up all the way to the front entrance, and in a flash, a woman flew out, running with a child in her arms. Another woman, who Nathaniel later found out was her sister, hurried behind. But by the time they got to the middle of the emergency room, heading towards the nurse's station, a woman gave out a piercing scream because she realized that the child had given up his last breath. She was so overwhelmed with grief that she almost dropped the child. He had suddenly become so heavy in her arms, the little boy who had been light and happy when he woke up that very morning. Had Nathaniel not been there to seize the child from her, the boy's body would have fallen to the ground, so distressed and weak his mother had become. And she was quite a fat, solid woman. There were several attempts to resuscitate, but after about 20 minutes, the child was pronounced dead by the doctor on duty in the emergency room, and the mother was taken into what was called the trauma room for stabilization and counseling. His mother said that the little boy had been eating dinner and had choked on something. Nathaniel hovered about. He was sweating and dizzy and feeling funny in his belly. He was asked to tow the stretcher off to the morgue, and he complied, but suddenly he was scared. It was Juju under that sheet. It was Juju, wasn't it? Nathaniel slowly pulled back the sheet. It was almost Juju. He spent less than 1 minute in the morgue. Then he walked quickly out to the back, and all his lunch came up. He felt trapped. He wanted to quit the job that first day. That's how my first day was, another porter said to him. You'll soon get used to it. Nathaniel had not realized that the porter was there. He did not quit. The other porter, Samuel, had been employed at the children's hospital for 8 years, and he was very proud of his job. He had a kind of reputation among the regular patients and the parents of children who kept coming back. For example, those who suffered from asthma. Samuel would take it upon himself to advise parents on how to go about sponging the child to reduce a fever and how to best administer doses of medication, just as he had heard the nurse explain to the patients over the years. But Samuel went about it in such a stern, authoritative manner, which contrasted so much with his humble porter's uniform, that the parents found him a source of ridicule. It was Samuel who took Nathaniel on a guided tour of the hospital grounds, wards, and peripheral buildings, and gave in gruesome detail all the various activities that were undertaken in each. There was a total of 7 wards, different from the quarantine ward and the wards for patients with highly infectious diseases. There were the labs and x-ray department, the operating theaters, 2 small rooms where parents could lodge on arrangement, the visitors' washrooms, and so on. There was a cafeteria, kitchen, and ancillary station, and over near the entrance there were the emergency rooms, waiting lobby, cashier's desk, pharmacy and nurses' station, as well as doctors' triage examination rooms and documents area. And there were several other rooms and departments as well. The children's hospital served the entire island, and many times children would be flown in for admission from various parishes, for emergency surgery or otherwise. Nathaniel's main duty was trolleying patients, their files and their luggage from admissions to the wards, or to the operating theater, or x-ray or labs, or wherever it was that they were supposed to go. He could be on the day shift or on the night shift, and it didn't really matter to him which one he was on. The only real difference was that the emergency room was less crowded at nights, but parents still rushed in with their children, suffering from all manner of ailments. The triage was a place where anything could happen at any time. You could never allow yourself to be caught off guard by a long stretch of peace and idleness. At any moment, things could erupt into chaos and distress. On the day shift, he would see every kind of case, not just emergencies, but also parents whose children had minor complaints, but who didn't have the money to see a private doctor. They were willing to endure the long wait until the emergency cases were cleared. On a huge sign in the emergency room, an advisory was written which stated that emergency cases would be treated as priority over minor cases, as was to be expected. The emergency cases typically included asthmatics in need of nebulization, children suffering from epilepsy, specific organ disease like of the liver or kidney, burns, choking, heavy bleeding, poison, any fever in very young babies, very high fever in older children, severe worm infestation, broken bones or unconsciousness, often resulting from falls. Nathaniel had not conceived that there were so many things that could go wrong with a child. There was long, tedious waiting on benches for those with minor ailments, such as scratches and bruises, the common cold, certain common rashes, or any other complaint that did not require prompt attention. It's like we come here to clean bench with our backside, the parents would lament. For they would have to be sliding on the benches as each person was called up to the nurse for assessment. Sometimes Nathaniel would take a child up to the ward and he would have to wait for some word from the doctor or nurse on duty to take back to admissions. During those times, he was privy to witnessing the most abominable scenes. For example, he would see the doctor hold up an X-ray printout, and on the printout you could see the impression of a child's throat area. And inside the throat, it was very obvious that some item had been lodged there. And Nathaniel would hear the doctor say to the mother, who was sitting and wringing her hands in terror, "Mommy, this doesn't look good. How did the child come to swallow the wedding ring anyway?" And she answered that she had left the ring in the basket on the dresser, and the inquisitive child had climbed up and taken the thing and somehow swallowed it. Many times, 1 or 2 police officers had to be summoned to ask a few pertinent questions of these relatives. There were children with malformations, with heads twice the diameter of their bodies, full of fluid. There was a 2-year-old girl who had almost asphyxiated when peanuts became lodged in her respiratory passage and had to undergo a bronchoscopy to remove the tiny fragments of peanuts from her lungs. Very touch and go, bated breaths all throughout. There was a little boy who had drunk caustic soda that had been unwittingly left in a bottle that usually held orange juice. The caustic soda had burnt right through his throat and damaged his mouth and tongue, and he drooled a thick, foul substance onto a bib that had to be constantly changed. It was a great wonder how he managed to live for so many months, but everyone, including his mother, who shouted at him when she came to visit, did not expect that he would live for much longer. She shouted at him not out of hatred but out of frustration and helplessness and a terrible lingering feeling of guilt. There was a little girl who had been born with a blockage in her stomach and was awaiting an operation. There were children with various degrees of burns all over their bodies who had to be confined on their backs for periods of time ranging from days to weeks to months. Nathaniel forced himself to witness all these cases. He had grown numb, and he did not turn away because he wanted to constantly remind himself of the callous behavior of Mr. Spiteful, just in case he had let down his guard and was beginning to think that there was any good in the man. Sometimes Nathanael spoke to the children. Some were too young to speak, some too ill to speak, and there were others who were conscious enough and old enough to carry on a conversation with him during his spare time. The older, stronger children were allowed to play with supervision outside on the corridors that spanned the length of the wards. They did not wear their own clothes, but clothes belonging to the hospital, which were disinfected and clean, too clean. Their play was not the abandoned frolic of country children darting through bushes or rolling down hillsides. It was not even the subdued giggles of city children trying to rough and tumble like cubs on concrete savannas. It seemed these children did not play at all. The romping was bridled and reserved, always conscious of rupturing stitches or hindering a leg from healing, and the shrieks were subdued so as not to awaken the more infirm. How could they play with abandon, faced as they were with the prospect of death, when all around them the air was full of moans and shrieks and the smell of mortality? Sometimes the parents, stricken with grief, would spend the night by the side of the children's beds, sleeping on uncomfortable chairs that made their backs ache. Sometimes they would sleep outside the ward on the bench along the corridor. They did not care about comfort or bathing or having meals. Their sole concern was that their child be delivered back to them in one piece, in due process. They were willing to endure the process no matter how long. Whenever he passed them in the night or in the day, Nathanael liked to start up a conversation with the ones who were awake and did not look so fazed. In his morbid way, Nathanael would do his best to prepare the parents for the impending doom. "Have you started making funeral preparations?" he would ask one woman. Revolted, she would respond by saying that no, she hadn't, because there was still a great chance that the child would pull through. "Sometimes they seem as if they will pull through, and then they just up and make a turn for the worse," Nathanael said. "Sometimes they go into surgery fine and dandy, and they don't wake up from the anesthesia. It's always good to be prepared." "But it's just a hernia," the lady said. "I've seen them die from simpler things," Nathanael responded. "How many children do you have, lady?" She said she had 3 in all. "Well, at least you have the other 2 to cheer you up," Nathanael continued reflectively. "Sometimes he takes them from parents who have no other child in the world, and that is always the hardest to cope with. Usually, the parents would slowly drift away from him. You should try Dobson's Funeral Home, Nathanael would tell another parent. They have a good funeral package with wreaths and caskets and everything, and they're just down the road. Are the risks really that great when they're doing circumcisions? The parents would ask, anxious that the doctors had not filled them in on the real gravity of the operation. They said it would only take a couple hours and then he could come home the same day. There are things that they will not tell you, Nathanael said wisely. This unhealthy business of him cornering the parents and advising them about making funeral arrangements and warning them to take a good last look at the child before they left, for he or she might not be alive when they returned, filled the parents with anxiety and despair. It was not long before word got to the administrator, who naturally wanted to have a word with Nathanael. We need staff who will cheer the families up, not sink them into further depression, the administrator said. The parents' outlook at the beginning of a child's surgery can greatly influence the outcome of that surgery. We have to raise their optimism, Mr. Hector, not lie to them, and we have to rally them through this difficult period. Nathanael said that he understood and promised to stop recommending the funeral preparations for children who had not been pronounced dead, indeed, had not even been critically ill. But Nathaniel was still convinced that he had been right. The administrator, locked away in his office, could not possibly grasp the gravity of the situation. Doctors and nurses and porters of all people would know. Nathaniel had seen doctors hovering over the incubators, manually operating the oxygen tubes that wound their way down the delicate nostrils of preemies. He had seen the doctors remain by the incubator long past the hour of duty, as if they had made some secret vow to that particular child to stay by the incubator until the child had passed the worst. And he had seen the doctors look hopeful and even smile because the preemie finally seemed to be coming around. Then the doctors would leave and return in the morning to hear that the preemie had died during the night and was now in the morgue. Doctors don't handle anybody in morgues. Doctors deal only with the living, up until and never beyond the point of pronouncement of death. The morgue was the domain of the coroner, the undertaker, the traumatized parent who sat with the frigid body of an offspring for hours, sobbing and saying goodbye, the obliging workers who hovered near, empathetic but wanting to close up and go home. The nurses, they would know. They were the ones who had made friends with the little 10-year-old girl suffering from that incurable disease. And they had had a party for her in April, thinking that she would not make it until her next birthday in August. But a miracle happened and the girl received a donor, and everyone said that finally she might be able to lead a normal life. Then, 2 days before she was released, the girl fell from her bed, developed an internal infection, and died. The nurses on that ward did not eat or sleep or smile for a good many days. So why should Nathaniel not tell the parents to prepare for the worst? Was it better to let them prepare for the best and then have their hearts broken? Whenever Tensi was on the ward, Nathaniel would hover about the doctors and ask them to tell him frankly, "So, how long do you figure she has, Doc?" And though the doctors reassured him that she was coming